Chapter 1. The Hook, in which a most unsettling discovery is made at Baker Street. The fog lay thick upon Baker Street that November morning, clinging to the railings and lampposts like some living thing reluctant to be dispelled by the weak London sun. From the upper windows of number 221B, the world beyond appeared muffled and distant, its usual clamor reduced to a dull, uneasy hush. It was in such an atmosphere, oppressive, intimate, and peculiarly suited to dark contemplations, that an incident occurred which would draw Sherlock Holmes and his companion into one of the most perplexing inquiries of their career. Dr. John Watson had risen earlier than usual, roused not by Holmes's violin, nor by the chemical experiments whose odors so often invaded the sitting room, but by an unaccountable sense of unease. There was, even before the day had properly begun, a feeling that something was amiss within the familiar walls of Baker Street. The rooms themselves, ordinarily a refuge of ordered chaos, papers strewn yet somehow catalogued by Holmes's singular mind, seemed subtly altered. It was Mrs. Hudson who first gave voice to the disturbance. Her knock, sharp and urgent, echoed along the narrow stairwell shortly after 8 o'clock. When Watson opened the door, he found their landlady pale and breathless, one hand pressed to her apron as though to steady herself. "Oh, Dr. Watson," she exclaimed in a low, trembling voice, There's been something dreadful in the front room." Holmes, who had been reclining upon the sofa with eyes half closed, sprang instantly to his feet. Any trace of languor vanished, replaced by that alert, hawk-like attention which Watson had learned to recognize as the prelude to intellectual combat. "Compose yourself, Mrs. Hudson," Holmes said calmly. "You are in no danger. Now, tell us precisely what you have observed." "There's blood, sir," she whispered. "A stain, on the carpet, right near the writing desk." At the word blood, Holmes's eyes flickered, not with shock, but with interest. He exchanged a brief glance with Watson, then seized his dressing gown and moved past the landlady without another word. The sitting room of 221B Baker Street was much as it had been the night before, yet one detail transformed it utterly. Upon the faded Persian carpet, not 3 feet from Holmes's well-worn chair, there lay a dark, irregular stain. It was unmistakable in character. Dried blood, deep brown at the edges, darker still at its center. Watson felt a tightening in his chest. "Good heavens," he murmured. "Holmes, neither of us is injured. Mrs. Hudson, are you certain no one—" "I haven't let a soul in, doctor," she protested. "I swear it." Holmes knelt beside the stain, producing a small lens from his pocket. He examined the carpet in silence, his long fingers hovering just above the fibers, never quite touching. "Most curious," he said at last. "Curious?" Watson repeated. "It looks positively alarming." "Exactly so," Holmes replied. "And that is what makes it curious. Blood where no wounded man can be found, no sign of disturbance, no cry heard in the night. Baker Street is not a place where such things occur without leaving a trail." He straightened and surveyed the room as a general might survey a battlefield. His gaze lingered on the desk, the hearth, the door, and finally the window overlooking the street below. "This stain," he continued thoughtfully, "did not arrive here by accident. Nor, I suspect, did it arrive alone." Watson watched his friend with a growing sense of foreboding. In all their years together, blood had too often marked the beginning of grim adventures, but never before had it appeared, unbidden and unexplained, within the very heart of their home. Before Watson could voice another question, a knock sounded at the door, this time firm, official, and unmistakably confident. Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard was shown in moments later, his keen eyes already taking in the room. "Morning, Holmes," he said briskly. "I was hoping I wouldn't have to see you so early, but it seems London has other plans." Holmes allowed himself the faintest smile. "Indeed, Lestrade," he replied. "It appears that Baker Street itself has become the scene of a crime. The only question is, whose?" And with that unspoken challenge hanging in the fog-laden air, a mystery was born that would test even Sherlock Holmes' formidable powers of deduction. Chapter 2. The Peculiarities of a Domestic Crime, in which Holmes discourses upon trifles, and deduction begins at home. Inspector Lestrade's presence lent the sitting room an air of official gravity, though it did little to dispel the uneasy feeling that clung to us all. He stood with his feet planted wide upon the hearthrug, hands clasped behind his back, peering down at the stain as though it might leap up and confess its secrets if only he stared long enough. "Well," he said at last, "I can't say I've ever been summoned to investigate a crime scene at Baker Street itself. There's a first time for everything, I suppose." Holmes had returned to his chair and seated himself with deliberate calm, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. "You may find, Lestrade, that the novelty of the location is the least remarkable aspect of this affair." Lestrade grunted. "Blood is blood, Holmes. Whether it's on a palace floor or your own carpet, it generally means someone's hurt, or worse." "Generally," Holmes echoed, "but not invariably. The danger of your profession, my dear inspector, is an over-fondness for generalities." Watson could not help but smile faintly at this, though my own nerves were far from settled. "Holmes," I interjected, "perhaps before we fence with Inspector Lestrade, you might explain how blood could appear here without any of us noticing a thing." Holmes turned his keen gaze upon me, and his expression softened slightly. "My dear Watson, before one can explain how, one must be certain of what. Let us begin there." He rose once more and crossed to the writing desk, gesturing for us to follow. "You observe the stain's position, near the desk but not beneath the chair. That alone eliminates several dramatic possibilities, which I can see forming in Lestrade's mind." Lestrade snorted. "Such as?" "Such as a wounded man collapsing where he sat," Holmes replied. "Had that occurred, the distribution would be quite different. Blood obeys gravity and circumstance. It tells a story, if one has patience to read it." He picked up a sheet of blotting paper from the desk. "Now, note this. No fresh smears, no attempts at concealment. Whoever caused that stain did not trouble themselves to wipe it away." "Or was interrupted," Lestrade suggested. "Or," Holmes countered, "did not consider it incriminating." This remark seemed to catch the inspector's attention. "You're suggesting it was left on purpose?" "I am suggesting nothing, yet," Holmes said lightly. "I am merely removing assumptions from our path." At this point, Holmes's eyes flicked to a corner of the room, and he smiled with a sudden, almost playful expression. "Watson, you recall the mud upon the boots of the man we passed yesterday evening on the stairs?" I blinked. "The fellow with the heavy tread? Yes. What of him?" Holmes turned to Lestrade. "Our good doctor noticed nothing remarkable about him, yet his boots told a story of recent travel. Clay from the Hampstead Heath path, mixed with chalk dust from a builder's yard. A man between employments, I should say." Lestrade frowned. "What has that got to do with the blood?" "Very little," Holmes admitted, "which is precisely the point. Observation is a habit, Lestrade, not a response to crisis. One sharpens it on trifles so that it does not fail when the matter is grave." I recognized this as one of Holmes's frequent demonstrations, an unrelated deduction offered not for its own sake, but to remind us of the method behind the madness. Still, my impatience grew. "Holmes," I said, "surely Scotland Yard did not come merely to hear about muddy boots." "No," Lestrade replied curtly. "We came because Mrs. Hudson sent word of blood, and because Baker Street is not known for practical jokes." Holmes inclined his head. "Quite so. And that brings us to the question of access. Mrs. Hudson, who has entered this room since last night?" "Only myself, Mr. Holmes," she said firmly, "and I'd have seen it if it were there before. I scrub these carpets regular, I do." Holmes nodded approvingly. "Your diligence does you credit, which tells us the stain is recent, within the last 12 hours at most." "Meaning it happened while you were both asleep?" Lestrade asked. "Or while we were out," I added. "Holmes, we dined at Simpson's last night and returned near midnight." "Precisely, Watson," Holmes said. "For a window of several hours, this room stood empty." Lestrade moved to the window and peered out. "No sign of forced entry. Window latch intact, door lock undisturbed." "Which narrows our field," Holmes said. "Either the intruder possessed a key, or was admitted willingly." "Admitted by whom?" Lestrade demanded. Holmes spread his hands. "That, Inspector, is the very question you are paid to answer." Despite the tension, I could not help but feel a stirring of excitement. There was something profoundly unsettling about a mystery that invaded one's own hearth, and yet something irresistibly compelling as well. Lestrade straightened. "I'll have men canvass the street. Someone must have seen or heard something." A commendable instinct, Holmes said. Meanwhile, I propose a quieter line of inquiry. The blood may belong not to a victim, but to a message. A message? I repeated. Holmes's eyes glittered. Blood is dramatic, Watson. It excites the imagination. If one wished to provoke attention, fear, or urgency, one could hardly choose a more effective medium. Lestrade scoffed. You make it sound theatrical. Crime often is, Holmes replied, particularly when it is meant to be seen. There was a pause, heavy with implication. Outside, the foghorn of a passing hansom sounded faintly, like a distant warning. At any rate, Holmes concluded, we must resist the temptation to treat this as a simple matter. A stain upon the carpet is merely the opening line of a longer narrative. And the rest of it? I asked. Holmes smiled thinly. Will be written elsewhere, Watson. Our task is to learn where and by whom. With that, he reached for his coat, and I knew that the quiet rooms of Baker Street would not contain this mystery for long. Chapter 3. The First Inspection, in which Holmes examines the scene and uncovers subtle signs that escape ordinary notice. Holmes's movements that morning were precise and deliberate, almost ceremonial in their meticulousness. He circled the sitting room of 221B Baker Street as though the furniture itself might contain a secret message, his eyes sweeping over every detail, every irregularity. Lestrade and I followed, the former with an air of cautious impatience, the latter with a growing sense of admiration tinged with unease. Observe, Watson, Holmes said, halting near the fireplace. Most people would look only at the stain itself, and perhaps the general disarray of the room. Yet the truth seldom lies in the obvious. I bent closer to the dark blot on the carpet. It seemed at first glance nothing more than a clumsy smear, the product of an accident or perhaps an ill-conceived prank. But Holmes did not touch it with his fingers. Instead, he examined it with his lens, his brow furrowed in concentration. Notice the pattern, he murmured. It is irregular, but there is directionality. A movement from west to east, not from a fall or collapse. Someone deliberately placed this blood where it would be noticed upon entry, yet did not anticipate how it would interact with the light from this window. Lestrade grunted. And that proves what exactly? That the stain is a signal, not a symptom, Holmes said. The hand that left it was controlled, intelligent, and concerned with visibility. Watson, I could not deny the force of his reasoning, yet I felt a growing impatience. Holmes, is it possible we are reading too much into what may be merely an accident? Holmes turned his piercing gaze on me. Impossible, Watson. Accident never leaves a signature. It may be undirected and messy, but it carries no intentional pattern. Observe here, along the edges of the blot, the carpet fibers are pressed in a manner consistent with careful manipulation rather than a haphazard sprawl. I knelt to examine it, but my attention was drawn instead to the desk itself. Papers lay scattered as they always did, yet a closer inspection revealed a single sheet, barely distinguishable from the others, tilted at a peculiar angle, its corners stained faintly with a trace of crimson. Holmes noticed it immediately. Ah, he said, lifting the paper delicately with tweezers. A minor detail to the untrained eye, but crucial. The blood has made contact with this corner, suggesting either the hand that left it brushed the desk, or that the sheet itself was moved after the fact. Lestrade frowned. So we have a moving stain and a signal. Sounds complicated enough. Complicated, Holmes repeated. Merely deliberate. Complication arises when one assumes intention without observation. I followed him as he moved to the window, peering down at the fog-laden street below. The window, he mused, is locked, and yet the latch bears a faint smear of some substance, chalk dust, I think, indicating that it may have been handled recently. Which means, Lestrade pressed. Which means, Holmes said slowly, that the intruder, or collaborator, entered by some clever means, perhaps unnoticed by the casual observer. But the key point is that our perpetrator is not desperate. He is confident, even theatrical. I glanced at Holmes's face, noting a flash of that familiar exhilaration he reserved for puzzles that truly engaged him. Do you intend to remain in the room, Holmes, or shall we inspect the rest of the apartment? Patience, Watson, he replied. The room itself will provide more than mere impressions if we attend carefully. See here, he crouched beside the hearth. The ash has been disturbed. Not heavily, mind you, but enough to indicate movement. A man of ordinary habits would leave the fireplace untouched overnight. Yet here we have signs that someone crossed this space deliberately. Lestrade leaned forward. And you think he went to the desk? Perhaps, Holmes said, his gaze returning to the blot. Or perhaps he merely wanted to attract attention to it. The brilliance of a signal is that it distracts from what follows. I noticed that Holmes had begun to move in small, precise steps across the carpet, brushing his fingertips lightly along edges, feeling the subtle textures of the fibers. You are detecting impressions, I said, but what exactly are you looking for? Holmes's eyes gleamed. The trajectory, Watson, the trace of movement. Every human interaction leaves a mark, however subtle. Step lightly and you shall see only the carpet. Attend carefully and you may perceive the evidence of intention. He paused, crouched, and held his lens over a small, dark fragment near the skirting board. Ah, here we have something more tangible. A minute fragment of fabric, torn no doubt from a glove. Note the weave and the coloration. Whoever was here did not anticipate a second pair of eyes attuned to such trifles. Lestrade peered closely. A glove? Are you certain? Certain, Holmes replied. And notice, Watson, the alignment of the fibers. The fragment was pressed against the carpet, not dropped. This is consistent with deliberate placement, perhaps unintentional in its precision. I felt a shiver run through me. The thought that some invisible hand had orchestrated these signals while we slept was unsettling. Holmes rose suddenly. And now we turn to the desk itself. Lestrade, note these drawers. They are all properly locked, save one. Observe the slight misalignment here. It suggests that it was opened recently, with care, and then closed again. Lestrade frowned. Why tamper with a desk if you are merely leaving a signal? Perhaps to mislead, Holmes said quietly, or perhaps to remove something of value or of interest. That we shall discover in time. Watson, I could not help but admire the subtlety of Holmes's method. Each tiny fragment of evidence was like a note in a larger symphony, one whose melody would remain incomprehensible to all but him. Holmes turned to us, his expression calm, almost imperious. We have the stain, a displaced sheet, a fragment of glove, disturbed ash, and a tampered drawer. Individually, each would be trifling. Taken together, they form a tapestry of intention. The question is, what message does it convey, and to whom? Lestrade's impatience flared. So what do we do now? Holmes's gaze shifted to the street once more. We observe, my dear inspector. We wait. For the hand that left this stain, like all clever hands, will act again, and when it does, we must be ready. The fog pressed against the window, gray and impenetrable. Outside, the city went about its usual business, unaware of the small, intricate drama unfolding above Baker Street. And within that quiet room, I realized that the first steps of a most extraordinary investigation had been taken, steps that would demand all of Holmes's skill, and perhaps more patience than I, or Lestrade, could muster. Chapter 4. The First Suspects, in which a seemingly logical culprit emerges, yet doubts begin to stir. Holmes and I had returned to the sitting room by mid-afternoon, after an initial tour of the surrounding street. Lestrade had dispatched his men to question the neighbors, and the fog had begun to thin slightly, revealing the outlines of shop fronts and the occasional hansom cab rattling along the wet cobblestones. Yet despite the sun's weak attempt to penetrate the city's gloom, the atmosphere within Baker Street remained dense with unease. The stain upon the carpet continued to dominate the room, a silent, inescapable reminder that a mystery had intruded upon the most ordinary of spaces. Holmes, as was his habit, ignored the stain for the moment, instead pacing along the room's length with his hands clasped behind his back. Watson, he said suddenly, the first inquiry must always be of opportunity. Who might wish to gain by making a scene in one's own home, or by drawing attention to what is otherwise concealed? I nodded, though my mind remained uneasy. Lestrade will already be canvassing for anyone who might have entered, but so far we have heard nothing definite, and Mrs. Hudson insists that no one came in. Indeed, Holmes said. Yet we must consider all who had access or who might contrive to gain it. Friends, acquaintances, service people, even the casual observer who has mastered the art of stealth. Each is a potential player, each is a suspect until proven otherwise. At this moment, the doorbell rang sharply, startling both Watson and Lestrade. Holmes's eyes glimmered with anticipation as Mrs. Hudson hurried to answer. A young man in a modest suit was ushered into the sitting room. His features were angular, with a nervous energy that suggested both haste and apprehension. "Mr. Holmes," he began, hesitating, I was told you could be of assistance." "Indeed," Holmes replied smoothly, his sharp gaze assessing every detail of the man's posture, his clothing, even the condition of his hands. "Please, be seated. And what, may I ask, is your business with us?" The young man's hands trembled slightly as he removed his gloves. "My name is Edward Caro. I am, employed by one of your neighbors. I fear I may be implicated in a matter of some urgency. I have come to clarify my position." Lestrade frowned. "You say you might be implicated. By whom?" "By whoever left the blood," Caro replied. "I work near Baker Street, delivering documents and parcels. Last night I passed the building and I may have been noticed." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "You passed Baker Street last night, Mr. Caro?" "Yes, around 11. I had deliveries for several clients nearby." "And did you enter number 221B?" Holmes asked, his tone mild but precise. "No, never. I assure you, I have never set foot inside." Holmes regarded him silently for a long moment. "Your nervousness is apparent, yet it is, if I may say, misplaced. It is always unwise to overstate one's guilt when none exists. Your description of your route is plausible, yet the question remains, why do you present yourself now, fearing implication?" Caro swallowed hard. I overheard some men in the street. They were talking about a bloodstain, here. They said it might involve someone who passes by regularly, someone seen near the door." Lestrade muttered under his breath. "That would be you, of course." "Yes," Caro said, turning to Lestrade, "and I am terrified I will be accused unjustly. I have no knowledge of the blood, no intention of harm." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his steepled fingers resting on his chin. "Your honesty is commendable, yet it is precisely your presence that makes you of interest. You had opportunity, and your anxiety suggests awareness of perception, if not of action." Caro's eyes widened. I swear it is nothing. Please, you must believe me." Holmes allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "And I do, provisionally. Yet Watson, Lestrade, observe how the first suspect arises naturally, opportunity combined with visibility. The casual observer is quick to suspect a nearby figure, and nothing is so ordinary as the nearby delivery man." Lestrade nodded, somewhat mollified. "Well, if he's innocent, at least we can confirm it quickly enough. A few questions and the matter is resolved." Holmes's expression hardened. "Be cautious, Lestrade. Innocence is not always apparent, and suspicion, though convenient, can be misleading. Note, Watson, that in almost every case of deliberate misdirection, the first suspect is the one the world expects, the one whose profile matches the narrative's simplest trajectory." I watched Holmes closely. "And you doubt that he is the culprit?" "Entirely," Holmes replied. "Yet Mr. Caro's arrival is, in itself, a clue. A person who fears attention may act to mitigate suspicion, but one who wishes to provoke it can similarly engineer visibility. Our task is to distinguish fear from orchestration." Caro shifted nervously in his chair. "I only wish to clear my name, Mr. Holmes. I have no desire for trouble." Holmes inclined his head, dismissing him with a wave. "For the moment, we accept your word. But the point is clear. The world is seldom simple. The first suspect is often too convenient, too visible, and therein lies the trap." Lestrade muttered something about following up with neighbors and left shortly thereafter, promising to return with any results. The sitting room returned to its peculiar stillness, the fog pressing softly against the window panes. Holmes resumed his wandering, inspecting the desk, the drawers, and even the hearth once more. his mind clearly working far beyond ordinary comprehension. "Watson," he said finally, pausing near the blot, "we have our first suspect, and yet I find myself entirely unpersuaded of his guilt. Observe, the narrative is too neat. A man seen, a man nervous, a man conveniently nearby. The kind of story Lestrade loves. But the true hand behind this will not announce itself so readily." I followed his gaze, staring at the dark blot on the carpet. It seemed, in the soft afternoon light, almost to pulse with secrets yet unrevealed. Holmes bent to examine the fragment of glove once more. "The first suspect is important, Watson, but only because he establishes expectation. Our task is to look beyond expectation, to notice what is hidden in plain sight. The true culprit, if I am correct, will exploit the obvious to conceal the extraordinary." I shivered at the thought. There was something unsettling in Holmes's certainty, something that warned me this case would prove far more intricate than a simple delivery man or a misplaced stain. Already the layers of misdirection were beginning to form, and Baker Street, our familiar sanctuary, had been transformed into a theater of hidden intentions. And so it was that Edward Carow departed, still pale and anxious, leaving us with the sense that the first suspect was, as Holmes had foretold, a convenient illusion, a distraction from the deeper, more carefully orchestrated puzzle that had begun to unfold within the walls of our own home. Chapter 5, The Secret Clue, in which Holmes discovers a subtle inconsistency unseen by others. The evening descended upon Baker Street with its usual quiet solemnity, the fog curling in from the Thames and cloaking the street in the soft, muted glow of gas lamps. Within 221B, the sitting room seemed heavier than usual, as though it had absorbed the tension of the day and retained it like a lingering aroma. Lestrade had departed after promising to return with updates from the neighbors, leaving Holmes and me once more in the company of our own thoughts, and the mysterious bloodstain that had transformed our home into a stage for some unseen drama. Holmes, as always, wasted no time on idle speculation. He was crouched near the hearth, peering intently at the ash as though it contained the blueprint of the city itself. I watched him quietly, taking in the subtle movements, the way his fingers traced the floor's surface, the tilt of his head, the occasional narrowing of his eyes. Every gesture spoke of a mind that could parse the minutest of signals from a room that would appear entirely ordinary to anyone else. "Watson," he said abruptly, straightening to pace before the window. "One may think this a domestic matter, and yet every detail is infused with intention. The blood is merely the overture. The true symphony lies elsewhere." I hesitated. "Do you mean the fragment of glove, the sheet, or the disturbance in the drawers?" Holmes shook his head. "Partly, yes, but also something subtler. A small discrepancy overlooked by all observers. The key to this puzzle, Watson, is a minor inconsistency." I frowned, sensing the air of portent in his tone. "A minor inconsistency?" "Precisely," Holmes replied. He moved to the desk, his long fingers skimming over the surfaces as if reading an invisible script. "Observe the position of the blotting paper. Yesterday, I noted it had been moved slightly from its usual alignment. A minor shift, of perhaps an inch. One might dismiss it, but consider this. If the blood touched its corner, why is it still neatly atop the sheet beneath? Why is it undisturbed?" I knelt beside him, straining to see the subtle positioning. "You think the blood's placement is deliberate?" I murmured, "and yet the paper appears unchanged?" "Exactly," Holmes said. "Either the individual responsible was astoundingly careful, or he, or she, failed to anticipate an effect that might betray their hand. It is this very contradiction that hints at the perpetrator's identity." Holmes rose and moved to the fireplace, examining the hearth once more. "Consider the ash," he said, tapping a finger lightly against the hearth. "Disturbed, yet not thoroughly. A man in a hurry would leave a mess. A meticulous intruder would avoid it altogether. Here we have a curious middle ground. Deliberate disturbance, designed to convey presence without revealing character." I struggled to follow him, my thoughts scattered by the complexity of the subtlety he described. "So the intruder is careful, but also wanting to be noticed?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Correct. And the fragment of glove confirms it. Look at its placement along the skirting board. Not dropped by accident, but pressed lightly, almost ceremoniously into the corner. Such a move suggests a person conscious of scrutiny, or perhaps wishing to create a diversion. I felt a chill as I realized the implications. Whoever had orchestrated this scene had not merely left a stain, they had choreographed it. Every detail, every minor movement, was calculated to suggest danger while concealing motive. Holmes turned to me, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. "Watson, you have noticed how our first suspect, Mr. Caro, presented himself. Anxious, almost panicked, eager to be dismissed as uninvolved. His arrival at Baker Street was predictable, a convenient coincidence. But note how he was drawn into the narrative, not by action, but by expectation." "Expectation?" I echoed. "You mean the world expects the delivery man to be a suspect?" "Precisely," Holmes said, "and therein lies the trap. Our perpetrator has relied on the ordinary observer's reliance on the obvious, yet one who observes with care will detect the inconsistency, the signal concealed within ordinary movement." He returned to the blot, peering through his lens. "Now, Watson, I must caution you. This clue is subtle. Lestrade, Caro, and even Mrs. Hudson remain unaware of it. To them, the case appears nearly solved, identified, comprehensible. But the true key lies in what is not immediately visible." I followed his gaze, scanning the blot again, the displaced sheet, the fragment of glove, and the ash. I could not yet discern what he had seen. "Observe," Holmes said, gesturing to the window latch, "the faint residue of chalk dust. I noted it earlier, and it is significant, but only in combination with the position of the paper and the ash. Consider the sequence. The intruder enters, or perhaps reaches through a partially open window. He leaves the blood, positions the sheet, disturbs the ash, and retreats. Yet one small element betrays the entire plan. The corner of the blotting paper that bears the faintest crimson mark is subtly misaligned with the drawer beneath. This tiny discrepancy, a fraction of an inch, reveals the direction of approach, the hand used, even the height of the individual." I stared at him in disbelief. "You can tell all that from an inch of misalignment?" Holmes's eyes sparkled with the certainty that only he could possess. "Not from the paper alone, Watson. From the relationship of all the elements, the blot, the paper, the fragment of glove, the ash, and the drawer. Each tells its own story, but together they expose the deception." He paused, pacing slowly. "And yet," he continued, "I shall withhold this observation from others for now. Lestrade believes the case may be near resolution. Caro believes himself in peril. The world perceives the obvious first suspect, and that is precisely the advantage our adversary has relied upon. If I reveal the inconsistency prematurely, the trap is spoiled. Patience, Watson, patience." I sank into my chair, a mixture of awe and trepidation washing over me. Holmes had uncovered a clue invisible to everyone else, and he had already begun to construct a strategy around it. Yet the subtlety of the observation left me uncertain of the precise path forward. Holmes returned to the hearth, examining the ash one final time before straightening. "Tomorrow, we shall pursue this thread further. The secret clue, hidden though it may be, will guide us toward the true architect of the scene. And mark my words, Watson, it is a hand both daring and meticulous, far beyond the reach of ordinary suspicion." The fog outside deepened once more, blanketing the city in its gray embrace. Within the sitting room, the faint stain upon the carpet seemed almost a pulse, a quiet herald of events yet to come. And I realized, with a mixture of admiration and unease, that the real puzzle had only just begun. Chapter 6, Rising Stakes, in which a second incident intensifies the mystery and Holmes's mind races ahead. The morning arrived with a faint drizzle, the kind that seems to soak into the bones rather than merely wet the coat. Baker Street lay quiet beneath a thin layer of mist, and the streets were only beginning to stir with the usual commerce of horse-drawn cabs, newspaper boys, and shopkeepers sweeping the grime from their doorsteps. Yet within the walls of 221B, a tension lingered that even the light drizzle could not wash away. Holmes sat by the window, hands clasped, staring out at the fog-bound street as if it alone might whisper secrets to him. "Holmes," I ventured cautiously, "do you expect anything further today? Lestrade has promised to return with news of Mr. Caro's investigation, but as yet no word has arrived." Holmes did not reply immediately. His eyes, sharp and luminous, remained fixed upon a distant point beyond the street. "Watson," he said at last, "I do not rely upon expectation. We must remain alert for developments, for a case that begins so delicately is seldom resolved by ordinary means." A sharp rap at the door interrupted our discussion. Mrs. Hudson, her expression unusually anxious, ushered in a uniformed messenger carrying a small parcel. Holmes took it without ceremony, slicing the string with his pocket knife and examining the contents. Inside was a letter, written in a precise hand, its ink freshly dried. Holmes's eyes flicked over it quickly, his expression darkening slightly. "Interesting," he murmured. "Very interesting indeed." I leaned over to glance, but he waved me back. "Patience, Watson. It is not for you, or for Lestrade, to digest this at present." The letter, as Holmes soon explained, contained no direct threat, no demand, no explicit accusation. Instead, it referred obliquely to the earlier incident, hinting that the bloodstain was but the first of several intended signals. The author, whoever he might be, claimed an intimate knowledge of Baker Street, and suggested that the observer's vigilance would be tested further. "Observe, Watson," Holmes said, folding the letter with care. "The handwriting, precise, deliberate, yet with small irregularities. It is designed to convey control while hinting at nervous excitement. Our adversary wishes to provoke attention and yet remain unseen." "Do you believe this?" I asked, "to be from the person who left the bloodstain?" Holmes nodded slowly. "Without a doubt. The timing, the tone, the medium, all indicate a single author. And observe how the message implies continuation. The first incident was merely an announcement. The second will confirm intent." Our discussion was interrupted again, this time by the arrival of Lestrade himself, flanked by 2 constables. He looked unusually grave. "Holmes, Watson," he began, "we may have a development. A Mr. Reginald Hawthorne, who resides a few doors down, reported a disturbance last night. Screams, apparently, though faint. When he looked from his window, he saw someone moving along the street, carrying what he described as a small package." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "And he provides a description?" Lestrade nodded. "Yes. He mentions a man of medium height, wearing a dark overcoat and a bowler hat. Nothing unusual, save that the figure seemed cautious, almost measured in movement. The timing coincides closely with the window of opportunity for our earlier incident." Holmes rose abruptly, moving to the desk and retrieving his magnifying glass. "Medium height, deliberate movements, cautious yet leaving a trace. It fits perfectly with our prior observations. Watson, we now see escalation. A second act, designed not merely to terrify, but to establish pattern." I felt a tightening in my chest. "So this is no random mischief?" "Hardly," Holmes replied. "Mischief is chaotic. This, Watson, is orchestration." We examined the letter together, noting the careful formation of letters, the spacing, and the subtle indentation upon the paper. Holmes explained that such minute details revealed not only the author's hand, but his likely physical stature, and even the amount of force he habitually applied while writing. "This is a game," Holmes said quietly, pacing the length of the room. "A game in which we are being observed as closely as we observe." I glanced at the blot on the carpet, which seemed, under the morning light, darker and more insistent. The idea that our adversary was actively manipulating events to create suspense and misdirection sent a shiver through me. "Holmes," I asked hesitantly, "does this imply a third or fourth incident? Are we to anticipate further messages?" "Undoubtedly," he replied, "and we must be ready to interpret them correctly. The first clue was subtle, the second slightly more overt, and the next will be designed to draw the casual observer's eye while concealing the truth. Our task is to pierce the veil of appearances." As we spoke, Mrs. Hudson returned from the hallway, carrying another small parcel, this one without any envelope. Holmes examined it carefully. Inside was a fragment of cloth, dark and slightly damp, with a small smear of crimson at one corner. "Watson," Holmes said, holding the fragment up to the light, "observe the weave, the texture, and the color. This is not random. It was left deliberately to provoke thought, to direct attention. And yet it contains a hidden inconsistency, the very element that confirms our adversary's hand." I studied it closely, noting how the dampness suggested recent handling, and how the small smear was incongruous with the fragment's size. Holmes smiled faintly. Yes, Watson, this fragment is both signal and misdirection. To all but the most careful observer, it points to a conclusion that is not the truth. That, I fear, is Lestrade's dilemma. The first apparent resolution is almost always a trap. The implications were clear. Our adversary was not merely leaving bloodstains or letters, but was orchestrating a sequence, each act building upon the last, testing our observation and reasoning. Holmes's excitement, usually restrained, now bordered on fervor. He moved about the room, retracing steps, examining furniture, adjusting the angle of light falling upon the carpet. "Watson," he said finally, pausing to peer through his magnifying glass at a faint indentation near the hearth. "This case is developing rapidly. The stakes have risen. Our initial observations, the first suspect, the letter, and now this fragment, all point toward a mind both meticulous and audacious, and I assure you, we are only at the beginning." I felt a mixture of anticipation and dread. Holmes had discerned the escalation, the increasing boldness of our adversary, and I realized that the challenge ahead would test not merely his powers of deduction, but the patience and vigilance of us all. The quiet of Baker Street had been shattered, replaced by a subtle tension, the sensation that at any moment another signal might appear, another clue, another trap, another layer of the mystery. As Holmes continued his inspection, I sat quietly, watching the fog press against the window, reflecting on the pattern forming before us. Each act, each detail, was a deliberate move in a game we had only begun to understand. And as the day darkened into evening, it became clear that Baker Street was no longer merely a home or a sanctuary. It had become the theater for a carefully orchestrated puzzle, one whose resolution would demand every ounce of Holmes's legendary insight. Chapter 7. Holmes's Strategic Play, in which Holmes sets a subtle trap to reveal the true culprit. By the following morning, the fog had settled so thickly over London that even the street lamps were swallowed in a dim, misty glow. Baker Street seemed almost suspended in time, the usual sounds of the city muffled to a distant hum. Holmes, however, appeared entirely undisturbed by the weather, moving about 221B with a precision and focus that suggested his mind was already far beyond the present moment. "Watson," he said, standing by the window, "our adversary is cunning, but all cunning rests upon predictability. Every careful hand leaves patterns, and every daring move carries a signature. Today we shall test both." I glanced at him curiously. "Test, Holmes? How do you propose to do that?" Holmes smiled faintly, the corner of his mouth lifting in a way I had learned to recognize as the herald of a plan. "By creating circumstances that encourage the true culprit to act. The first incident was a signal, the second a provocation. Now we shall provide a stage and observe the performance." Our strategy began with careful preparation. Holmes instructed Mrs. Hudson to tidy the sitting room meticulously, restoring the furniture and carpet to their usual positions, yet leaving the faintest trace of the original bloodstain and the fragment of glove in precisely the same place. "The room must appear ordinary, Watson, yet retain the marks that speak," he explained. "Any observant intruder will note their persistence." Next, Holmes arranged the writing desk with a deliberate imperfection. One drawer left slightly ajar, papers subtly displaced as if by accident. The careful orchestration of this minor disorder, he told me, was intended to lure the perpetrator into action, prompting them to correct, remove, or add to it. Lestrade arrived mid-morning to report that all nearby streets had been canvassed, and that Mr. Caro had been accounted for and fully exonerated. "As I suspected," Lestrade said, "the man was merely anxious, nothing more." Holmes gave a faint nod. "Precisely, Lestrade, and that is why the first suspect was of interest. He establishes expectation. The true hand, however, will not be content merely to observe." Once our preparations were complete, Holmes instructed me to remain quietly at my writing desk while he moved about the room, inspecting angles of light and shadow, the position of furniture, and the subtle placement of objects. "The key," he whispered, "is to remain invisible in plain sight. The intruder must believe the room unobserved, yet every movement will be noted." Hours passed with the slow, deliberate cadence of anticipation. Holmes scarcely spoke, and I busied myself with recording observations. noting that the faint smear on the carpet appeared darker in certain angles of light. A trick of perspective, no doubt, but one Holmes seemed to treat as significant. Then, as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, a sound caught our attention, a soft, deliberate scraping at the window. Holmes's head shot up instantly, eyes narrowing. "Watson," he whispered, "observe closely. The stage is set." From the street below, a man's shadow moved with cautious precision along the outer sill. Holmes rose and signaled for me to remain still. The figure paused, peering into the sitting room, then slipped inside as though the window were a familiar entrance. I held my breath as he moved toward the desk, his hands adjusting the slightly ajar drawer, his eyes flicking to the faint traces left on the blotting paper and carpet. Holmes observed every gesture, his own posture relaxed, but his gaze unyielding. The intruder, confident in the belief that no one was watching, then reached toward the fragment of glove near the skirting board, lifting it carefully and examining it as if to ensure no trace had been overlooked. At that moment, Holmes stepped forward. "Indeed," he said, his voice calm but commanding, "I think you have tampered sufficiently." The man startled, almost dropping the fragment. He turned, eyes wide, and I saw recognition, shock, and desperation all mingled upon his face. "Holmes," he exclaimed, the name tasting almost like a curse. I did not intend." Holmes raised a hand. "Spare words, sir. The evidence is already complete. Observe, Watson. The fragment, the stain, the drawer, the ash, all orchestrated with precision. The true hand is revealed not merely by error, but by predictability. This man, your movements, your gestures, your slight hesitation at the window, confirm the pattern." I noticed how methodically Holmes had used the room itself to draw the perpetrator out, creating a subtle stage that required no confrontation, no chase, no struggle. The intruder's own actions had delivered him into Holmes's observation. Lestrade, who had followed from the street entrance, stepped forward cautiously. "Shall we—" "No," Holmes interrupted. "Let him speak first. It is often more instructive to hear the confession after the fact than to force it prematurely." The man's shoulders slumped, the tension in his body finally giving way. "You see too clearly," he muttered. "I thought my movements were unobserved. I only wanted to signal. I did not wish to harm anyone." Holmes's eyes never left him. "A signal can be made with discretion, yet you left traces, minor inconsistencies that betray the hand of even the most meticulous operator. Your desire to be noticed, and yet unseen, was your undoing." The intruder's lips tightened, and he looked down at the fragment in Holmes's hand. "I only wanted to be certain someone would see." "And see they did," Holmes replied, placing the fragment on the desk. "But the observer must also interpret correctly, and therein lies the advantage of patience, Watson. Observe how the simplest trap, the suggestion of ordinary action, exposes extraordinary intent." I marveled at the quiet brilliance of the strategy. No violence, no deception on our part, only the careful orchestration of a room and the observation of natural human behavior. Holmes had created a stage and allowed the perpetrator to act, revealing himself entirely through his own choices. The man slumped fully into the chair now, the fight gone from him. Holmes stepped back, satisfied, and motioned to Lestrade. "Take him, Inspector. The evidence is complete. The game is concluded in our favor." As Lestrade secured the intruder, Holmes turned to me with that faint smile of satisfaction that I had come to recognize as both triumphant and teasing. "Watson, this is the art of deduction in its most refined form. One need not confront. One need only observe, guide, and wait. The truth will present itself to those patient enough to perceive it." I nodded, still absorbing the elegance of the maneuver. Baker Street had been transformed once again, this time not into a site of mystery, but a stage for revelation. Yet even as the intruder was led away, I sensed, as always with Holmes, that the story was far from complete. The threads we had pulled thus far had revealed the culprit, but the intricacies of motive, method, and misdirection remained to be unraveled. And in the quiet of the foggy afternoon, I realized that our adventure was entering a new phase, one where patience, observation, and intellect would be tested to their utmost limits. Chapter 8. The Reveal, in which Holmes unravels the intricate web of deception. The sitting room of 221B Baker Street had returned to a semblance of calm following the morning's events. though the air still seemed charged with the tension of revelation. The intruder, now in the custody of Lestrade's men, had been led away with no struggle, leaving behind only fragments of evidence and a lingering sense of unresolved questions. Holmes, as ever, moved about the room with deliberate calm, touching no object but observing all, his mind clearly tracing threads invisible to ordinary eyes. "Watson," he began, pacing before the window, "the case is, in a manner of speaking, concluded. Yet there remains the matter of interpretation, the explanation that must satisfy both logic and the eye." I leaned forward, eager for the elucidation I had been anticipating for days. "Holmes, I confess I am still uncertain. The man was caught in the act, yes, but how do the fragments, the stain, and the letters fit together into the sequence you discerned?" Holmes smiled faintly. "That, my dear Watson, is the elegance of deduction. One must begin at the beginning, or, more precisely, with the smallest details that appear insignificant to the casual observer." He moved to the carpet and crouched beside the original bloodstain. "Consider this blot," he said, pointing with his lens. "It was left not to injure, not to frighten, but to communicate. The directionality, the placement near the desk, and the faint contact with the blotting paper indicate deliberate intention, a signal designed to attract attention and suggest urgency. Yet the manner of its application betrayed the perpetrator's height and handedness." I followed his explanation, nodding slowly. Holmes's ability to extract information from what seemed trivial never failed to amaze me. "Next," Holmes continued, "we have the fragment of glove. Pressed lightly into the corner of the room, it created a deliberate inconsistency. It is a classic device: distract the observer while simultaneously revealing the intruder's presence. The fragment confirmed that the individual had handled objects near the desk and hearth, yet wished to remain unseen." "Then the ash?" I asked, still piecing together the chronology. Holmes gestured toward the hearth. "A small disturbance, sufficient to suggest movement without revealing identity. Our intruder wished to demonstrate presence and control, yet he underestimated the subtlety required. The ash, combined with the drawer's misalignment, completed the spatial pattern. Each element reinforced the narrative of careful observation and deliberate signaling." He rose and picked up the fragment of cloth left with the letter. "And this, Watson, represents the final piece. A deliberate provocation, designed to confirm the intruder's own narrative. The dampness, the faint smear of crimson, the precise fold, all pointed to the individual now in custody. He sought to ensure recognition while believing himself undetectable." Lestrade, who had remained standing near the door, muttered, "I understand the theory, Holmes, but how could you be so certain before catching him? All these signals, they could belong to anyone." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Indeed, Inspector, that is precisely why careful observation is required. The first suspect, Mr. Caro, was convenient and plausible. The world expected him to be guilty, yet nothing about him matched the hidden inconsistencies we observed. The true perpetrator left traces that betrayed method beneath apparent chaos. That is the difference between speculation and deduction." I found myself marveling anew. "And the letters?" Holmes folded his hands behind his back and began pacing slowly. "The letters served to escalate the situation, to test both vigilance and interpretation. The handwriting, spacing, and minor irregularities revealed both nervousness and meticulousness. Each element was a signal, deliberate, yet disguised as natural error. Our adversary sought to manipulate perception, guiding us toward expectation while concealing the reality." I glanced toward the window, noting the faint shadows on the street and the muted light of the afternoon. "Holmes, it seems almost theatrical." "Precisely," Holmes replied, a faint smile touching his lips. "A criminal mind, particularly one skilled in observation, often relies upon theatricality. It is a form of misdirection. The observer attends to the dramatic, while the subtle remains unnoticed. That is why patience and careful scrutiny are indispensable." He stopped near the desk, lifting the slightly ajar drawer. "Observe, Watson, the drawer's misalignment was not accidental. It suggested intrusion and action without revealing motive. Combined with the other signs, it established a sequence of events: entry, signal, minor adjustment, and retreat. Each step corresponded to a deliberate intention, forming a narrative that only the attentive mind could reconstruct." I nodded slowly, the elegance of his reasoning sinking in. "And the intruder, caught today, He acted according to that pattern, confirming your deductions. Exactly, Holmes said, his voice calm but triumphant. By creating conditions that mirrored the original environment, I prompted him to repeat the behavior that betrayed him. Observation alone could not suffice. We needed action. Once he moved, the pattern became unmistakable. Lestrade, who had been listening intently, stepped forward. Remarkable, Holmes. You set a stage, then let him reveal himself. Holmes inclined his head. Indeed, Inspector, the cleverest trap requires no force, only subtle guidance, and the advantage lies with the observer who can perceive intention within ordinary movements. I sat back, exhausted yet exhilarated. Holmes had transformed what began as a simple bloodstain into a labyrinth of subtle clues, each interlocking with the next, culminating in the capture of a man who believed himself unseen. The elegance of the plan, the careful orchestration of signals, and the attention to the minutest details all spoke of a mind that operated on a level far beyond ordinary comprehension. Holmes's gaze softened slightly as he glanced around the room. Watson, it is not merely the capture that matters, but the understanding. Each detail, each inconsistency, each minor signal, together they form the logic of the solution. To observe, interpret, and anticipate is to master the art of deduction. I felt a deep admiration, mingled with awe and relief. The mystery had been resolved, yet the method, the subtle interplay of observation, misdirection, and patient calculation, left me more impressed than ever. Baker Street had been transformed into a theater of intelligence, a stage on which only Holmes could interpret the performance. And as the afternoon shadows lengthened and the fog pressed softly against the window panes, I realized that, in the hands of Sherlock Holmes, even the smallest details could yield the most extraordinary revelations. Chapter 9, Aftermath, in which the consequences of the case unfold and Watson reflects on Holmes's genius. The street outside 221B Baker Street had returned to a semblance of ordinary life, though for those of us within the rooms above, the events of the past few days lingered like a persistent echo. The fog had begun to lift, revealing the cobblestones slick with rain and the occasional pedestrian hurrying along under umbrellas. Yet despite the apparent calm of London, the atmosphere within our home remained charged with the residue of intrigue, a quiet tension that spoke of human motives revealed and misdirections unmasked. Holmes, as usual, had resumed his station by the window, peering out with a steady, analytical gaze. His violin lay untouched in its corner, the chemical apparatus on the sideboard undisturbed, yet there was an intensity about him that suggested he had not truly relaxed since the capture of our intruder. Lestrade had departed earlier in the morning, having taken the man into custody. The inspector had left with polite praise, a mixture of admiration and frustration evident in his expression. He had remarked upon the unusual method of capture, noting how Holmes had relied not upon brute force or coercion, but upon the subtle orchestration of environment and observation. Watson, I watched my friend silently, reflecting on the sheer elegance of his strategy to set a trap so complete that the intruder's own actions revealed him, without confrontation, without coercion, was nothing short of extraordinary. Yet as I considered the chain of events, a deeper realization came upon me. Holmes had not merely captured a criminal, he had orchestrated a lesson in human psychology, in the interplay of perception, expectation, and deduction. Holmes, I ventured, unable to contain my curiosity, do you think the man truly understood what he was part of? Or was he merely acting out of habit, unaware that he was guiding you to his own undoing? Holmes's eyes flicked toward me, sharp and piercing, yet softened by a faint trace of amusement. Both, Watson. He acted according to his understanding, yet he underestimated the observant mind. A criminal may be meticulous, but he cannot entirely remove himself from the predictable patterns of human behavior. Observation alone is insufficient. One must interpret what is observed within the context of human nature. I nodded, attempting to absorb the weight of his words. So the entire sequence, the bloodstain, the letters, the fragment of glove, even the disturbed ash, was all intended to mislead and yet revealed the truth to the careful observer. Exactly, Holmes said, returning to his habitual pacing. The cleverness lies in the balance between signal and misdirection. The intruder believed he controlled the narrative, yet each minor inconsistency betrayed him. Patience and observation allowed us to perceive the hidden logic. I felt a mixture of admiration and exhaustion. It was as if the events of the past days had been both a puzzle and a performance, and I had been permitted only the privilege of watching Holmes interpret it. Mrs. Hudson entered quietly, placing a tray of tea upon the small table between the chairs. She gave a gentle sigh, as though the tension of the household had weighed upon her as heavily as upon any of us. "I dare say," she said softly, "I'm glad the disturbance is over. Baker Street has been far too lively for comfort." Holmes inclined his head. "Indeed, Mrs. Hudson. And yet, as you know, activity is inseparable from observation. Even a moment of calm may conceal subtle patterns." I took the cup of tea she offered, reflecting on the remarkable sequence of events. The first suspicion, that of Mr. Caro, had been a convenient illusion. The bloodstain, the letters, and the fragment of cloth had served as signals and distractions. The intruder's own movements had revealed him, and Holmes had orchestrated the final act with the precision of a master chess player. "It is remarkable," I said, "how the smallest details prove decisive. One would scarcely think that a misplaced sheet or a fragment of glove could determine the course of a case." Holmes allowed a faint smile. "The significance of detail is often underestimated, Watson. What appears trivial to most is, in fact, the key to the entire puzzle. Observation without comprehension is useless. Comprehension without observation is incomplete. One must combine both to reveal the truth." I reflected further, realizing that the case had provided more than the capture of a criminal. It had offered insight into human character and into Holmes himself. His genius was not merely in noticing the unnoticed, but in interpreting the invisible logic behind action, in perceiving intention hidden within ordinary behavior. "Do you think," I asked after a pause, "that this intruder will act again? Or has he been entirely neutralized?" Holmes shook his head, his expression inscrutable. "Neutralized in the immediate sense, Watson. Yet human nature is persistent. Some individuals, driven by meticulous calculation and audacity, may seek opportunity again. We must remain vigilant, even when the immediate threat is removed. The important lesson is the method of deduction, the ability to perceive beyond expectation." The late afternoon light had shifted, casting long shadows across the sitting room. The faint traces of blood and the fragment of glove seemed now almost insignificant, yet I knew that they had contained the essence of the puzzle, guiding Holmes to the truth. I sipped my tea in silence, considering the complexity of what we had witnessed. Holmes moved quietly about the room, occasionally examining a surface or lifting an object, as though ensuring that no hidden clue had been overlooked. His attention to detail, his unwavering patience, and his insight into the subtleties of human behavior had once again solved a case that would have confounded ordinary minds. At last, Holmes settled into his chair, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. "Watson," he said quietly, "we may now allow ourselves a brief interval of reflection. The puzzle has been resolved, yet the lessons it imparts remain. Always observe, always interpret, and never assume that the obvious is the truth." I nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and admiration. Baker Street had returned to its quiet routine, yet the memory of the past days lingered, a vivid reminder of the elegance of Holmes's method and the subtle interplay of signal, misdirection, and revelation. As the evening deepened, I reflected on the capture of the intruder and the intricate reasoning that had brought it about. In every detail, in every minor inconsistency, Holmes had demonstrated the extraordinary power of observation and intellect. It was a privilege to witness his genius, and I felt, as I often did, both humbled and inspired by the extraordinary mind with which I shared Baker Street. The case had ended, yet its lessons endured. In the quiet aftermath, I realized that the brilliance of Sherlock Holmes lay not merely in the solution of puzzles, but in the clarity with which he illuminated the hidden logic of human behavior, revealing truths invisible to all but the most attentive observer. Chapter 10. Outro, in which Holmes reflects upon the case and prepares for new mysteries. The evening in Baker Street was unusually still. The fog, once oppressive and impenetrable, had thinned to a fine mist that clung to the gas lamps outside, casting the street in a soft, golden haze. Within 221B, the sitting room was quiet, the faint traces of the day's events now mere echoes upon the carpet and furniture. Holmes sat in his chair, legs crossed, hands steepled beneath his chin, staring thoughtfully into the distance. I took my own seat, feeling the weight of reflection pressing upon me. The case of the blood stain and the subsequent intruder had demanded every ounce of Holmes's intellect, patience, and subtlety. We had witnessed a carefully orchestrated web of signals, misdirection, and deliberate deception. Yet through it all, Holmes had remained several steps ahead, quietly observing, interpreting, and anticipating. "Holmes," I began, "now that the matter is concluded, I cannot help but marvel at the subtlety of the entire affair. The blood stain, the glove fragment, the letters, the disturbed ash, every minor detail was significant." Holmes's eyes flicked toward me, sharp and assessing, yet softened by a faint hint of amusement. "Watson, significance exists not in the detail itself, but in the relationships between details. A solitary clue may mislead. The pattern it forms with others illuminates intention. It is the orchestration of minutiae that transforms chaos into logic." I nodded, reflecting on how the first suspect, Mr. Caro, had served as a convenient distraction, while the real culprit's carefully controlled behavior had left subtle inconsistencies that only Holmes had discerned. "And yet," I said, "it was the intruder's own actions, prompted by your preparation, that revealed him completely. No confrontation was required. The room itself became the trap." Holmes allowed a faint smile to touch his lips. "Exactly. Force is unnecessary when one understands human behavior. By creating circumstances that guided him, we observed him yielding information entirely of his own volition. That is the elegance of deduction, Watson, to extract truth without disturbing it more than necessary." I could not help but admire the sophistication of his reasoning. The interplay of observation, subtle manipulation, and patient anticipation had turned a simple domestic disturbance into a revelation of character and intent. Holmes leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. Cases such as this remind us that human ingenuity is both admirable and dangerous. Our adversary acted with meticulous precision, yet he underestimated the power of patient observation. He believed that careful theatrics would conceal intention, yet every small inconsistency betrayed him. I took a moment to study him, noting the familiar blend of pride and detachment in his expression. "And yet," I said, "you allow him the dignity of his own errors, waiting for him to reveal the truth himself rather than forcing a confession. That is what separates your method from ordinary detection." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Detection is not merely about apprehending the guilty. It is about understanding the motive, the method, and the pattern of thought. To see clearly is to comprehend both the act and the actor. And in so doing, one uncovers not only the criminal's plan, but the logic of the universe as it is reflected in human behavior." I felt a quiet reverence as I listened. Holmes's capacity to transform observation into comprehension, and comprehension into action, was unparalleled. In the quiet aftermath of the case, one sensed that the resolution was not merely a triumph of intellect, but a reaffirmation of order in a world too often governed by chance and impulse. "Watson," Holmes said at last, breaking the silence, "you will write this case, I hope, as you do all others. The lesson is subtle, but essential. Never assume that the obvious is the truth, and never overlook the smallest irregularity, for therein lies the key to understanding." I smiled, already envisioning the narrative I would record. "It shall be done, Holmes. As always, your deductions are as precise as they are remarkable. London may never fully comprehend the care with which you perceive what others overlook." Holmes's eyes twinkled with that rare hint of satisfaction. "And yet, Watson, one must not dwell too long on triumph. There are always further puzzles, further enigmas. The city teems with them, and our work is never complete. Today, the intruder. Tomorrow, perhaps something far subtler, far more intricate. Such is the life of the detective." I felt a thrill of anticipation at his words. To share Baker Street with Sherlock Holmes was to witness the constant interplay of logic, human behavior, and the pursuit of truth. Each case was a challenge, each observation a test, and each revelation a triumph of intellect over deception. The evening deepened, and the mist outside thickened once more, curling against the windows as though eager to conceal the secrets of the city. Holmes returned to the window, scanning the street with that unerring gaze that had missed nothing over the years. "Come, Watson," he said at last, rising from his chair. "Let us prepare for whatever may arrive next. The city will provide its puzzles, and we must remain ready. Observation, deduction, patience, these are our allies, and with them, no secret can endure forever." I followed him silently, carrying both admiration and relief in equal measure. The case of the bloodstain was concluded, yet in the quiet aftermath, one understood that the work of Sherlock Holmes was never truly finished. London's streets, its fog, its mysteries, all waited to challenge his mind anew. And I, ever his companion, would be there to record, to learn, and to witness the brilliance of a mind that could see what others could not. Baker Street had returned to its calm exterior, but beneath the surface, the echoes of logic, misdirection, and revelation lingered, a reminder that in Holmes's hands, even the smallest clue could illuminate the grandest truth.